quotations that we can use to provoke a discussion. So what we'll do is I'll talk for a few minutes, and then we'll look at a little passage. It's not even a whole document, little passages. And then what we'll do is I'll go back and present on another aspect of the presentation. We'll come back and look at another document, and then we'll have a more ranging discussion perhaps at the end. So if that would be, that's how it's going to go. So let me see if I can share my screen. All right, let's see. Okay, so. Okay, hopefully you could see that. Is that good? All right, excellent. Okay, so when I was talking to Wendy about topics for discussion, we chatted about different things, and I looked at the list of what other people were presenting upon. And so what I decided to do is talk about today an issue that all teachers of American history struggle to teach in their classrooms. And so this is what some of this what I want to present is how I would present this to my students, certainly, but to try to give us a little bit of a historical sense of how to deal with colonial and Native American relations with one another. So I'm just south of Atlanta. I deal with I'm in a school. We have our population is about 70%, 75% African American, about 15% white, and then the rest is mostly Southeast Asian. So I have a rather diverse group of people. Many of my students did not grow up, or their parents are certainly not from Georgia. So Atlanta, people come here from all over the place. And so one of the things that I know when they walk into the classroom is that they have a certain story about American history, even if it's very, very basic. But it always is very much I call it cartoonish. In other words, it's not really based on much historical knowledge. And some of that has to do with how they've been taught in the past and how American history is often presented. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit today about the relationship between English traders in the Southeast in the 18th century and the Creek Indians, right, which were the dominant native group in the Southeast region, and what is today Georgia, Alabama, and parts of North Florida. Okay, so what I'm going to, let's look a little bit about this. So why is this subject of interest? Well, first of all, we all have to teach it. If you're in the classroom, this is almost always something that we have to teach. And oftentimes, the story of colonial and Native relations is told in an ideological way rather than a historical way. So what do I mean by that? Well, historians are measuring change over time. So we're looking at a subject and we're trying to understand through the experiences of the people who were involved, what changed and what stayed the same over time. And so historical thinking is oftentimes very difficult, as we all know. And teaching historical thinking is often very difficult, as we all know, because the story isn't always what we think it was, right? So we may have a view of what it should have been or might have been or was. And so when we go back and look at sources, oftentimes we find things a little bit difficult, right? A little bit difficult to understand. So ideological ways of understanding is just kind of substitute your politics for doing history, which too often happens. And my students want to go to that immediately. So I say, you got to hold on. We'll get there. We'll let you say what you think. Let's look historically and see what changes over time. So this example that we'll look at is one that is based on how the relationship between English colonists and the Creek Indians changed over a period from 1685, when they first established a trading relationship until right before the American Revolution. So we're staying in the colonial era. Okay, so let me say two things. One thing, the first thing is a problem of sources. So historians have written extensively on this subject for a good amount of time. There is a large literature on it going back about 70 or 80 years. But the problem is that when we're in the 18th century, the Creeks were an illiterate people. That is, they didn't read or write, right? That's not a derogatory term. It's just a statement of fact, right? They didn't have a written language. And so we do not have any written sources from the Creeks before the Revolution. So historians studying colonial history have struggled with this issue in discussing not only the topic of Native American and colonial relations, but also things like colonial slavery, for example. So this is another issue there. So history is a problem of sources. Historians need sources to understand the past, but what happens when you're trying to study people who we don't have sources from, right? Now, we do have sources from many of the people who encountered the Creek Indians, but we don't have their own writings until later on. Okay, so so my caveat here, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means in a second, but my caveat here is simply to say that what I'm about to present to you is a very simplistic and distilled version of a debate that has raged for 60 years among historians, and there's numbers of important books on the subject. So I'm simplifying it down, but hopefully this can give us as teachers a way to kind of think about how to approach this topic. Okay, so let's see what I have. Okay, so one of the books that, well, I'm going to use, one of the big books, if you will, on the topic, I'm going to put it in front of the camera for a second, is this one. It's called Deerskins and Duffels. The author is Catherine Holland Braun. It's from the early 1990s, I think 1992 or 3, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 1993. And it is, Braun was a professor. I don't know if she's retired or not. She was a professor at Auburn University. And she taught about the history of the 18th and early 19th century South, okay? Now, Braun she had studied under another prominent scholar of this period, and she had an insight in part of her readings that led to this book. She said, if somebody doesn't have anything that they have said, that they've written down, how can we understand them? Well, we can understand them through the eyes of others, of course, through the documents we do have, mostly from European sources. But what about if we study how they acted, right? So in other words, if I'm not, this could produce some limitations, but still, if I don't know what somebody's thinking because they won't tell me, I might be able to observe how they act, right? And that could give me a good gauge of how to think about their perspective on an event. Now, again, we have to say that with some caution because we don't have the sources of them telling us. But historians often have to come up with ways, maybe creative ways, not making up things, but right, ways in which we're making an argument around the sources we do have, knowing their limitations. Okay, so the subject of Catherine Holland Braun's book is on trade. And so what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about the trade between the English and the Creek Indians. And we're going to use that to see how this relationship changed over time, and then think about what does this tell us about how to study or understand as well as teach this history, right? This history of colonial and Native American relationships. Okay, so that's where we're headed. Okay, so let's start off then and talk about trade. So if we say what is trade, a common definition is it's a mutual exchange, a mutual exchange. All right, now a mutual exchange is simply, let's think about what that means. So an exchange is when I give you something and you give me something in return. And if it's mutual, that means both of us agree to the transaction, right? Now, in other words, if I would come to your house and say, "Oh, I like your car," and you say, "Well, you can sell it to me for $10,000," and I said, "How about I just take it?" Yeah, I mean, well, that's not a mutual exchange, right? You say, "Well, that's stealing," right? Okay, so a mutual exchange has to be right desired. Now, I might go to the gas station and not like paying the price for gas, but if I want to get right from point A to point B, I've got to fork over the money, right? So the point is here that it is mutual, even if we don't like necessarily all of the terms of the trade, right? I need that gas more than I needed the $50 to fill, that it took to fill my tank. All right, so it is a mutual relationship. Okay, so that's important. All right, we're going to get to, so I'm going to describe the trade and then we're going to get to a document and talk about it for a couple of minutes. So, normally they say PowerPoint should have no text, but just pictures, but I'm putting text for a purpose that we can have some facts here and we can kind of discuss it a bit. Okay, so we're going to look right at the trade and its effects primarily on the Creek Indians by looking at how this trade changed over time. So here's what the Creeks had. This is what they had. They were great hunters and they had huge herds of deer in the Southeast that they hunted regularly. But right, the English had a need for deer skins to make leather out of, and leather was used for all kinds of different things. Now, the Creeks were interested in English manufactured goods, clothing in particular, tools, and weapons, firearms. Okay, so this is in particular what they're interested in trading. And so in 1685, the English they're out of South Carolina at this point. Georgia's not founded yet. Out of South Carolina, establish a relationship, a trading relationship with the Creek Indians. Okay. Now, you also have Spanish trying to establish relationships with the Creeks. And eventually, in the next generation, France will build a fort on the edge of Creek country and also try to gain Creek alliances. But we're going to simplify this down and look at the English. Okay, so it's deer skins is what they're hunting. This is the product that they're trading. Okay, and they're getting what they want for it is manufactured goods. Okay, stuff that they can't produce with their own technology. Okay, so this is the land we're talking about, right? You can see much of the states today of Alabama and Georgia. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about Creek culture in a moment. Okay, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. All right. All right, so if we can look with what we're trying to do is we're going to see if we can look at both sides of this trade. How did this trade work? The deer skins versus in the manufactured goods. Can we see what are the consequences of this trade? Does this help us to see the attitudes of Native peoples in this case who did not have a written language, did not express themselves to us in their own words per se. So maybe we can try to understand what they were thinking, and we can also understand the English perspective of the English colonists as well, and then maybe draw some tentative conclusions. All right, let's look at a few facts. Okay, so there's a couple of facts that we need to know about the Creeks and a little bit about the English colonists. So during the 18th century, what we call the Creek Nation has about 14,000 warriors. Now, we might say that doesn't seem like a lot of people. However, right, the Creeks outnumbered the militias from South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida all put together. Well, the Florida's under the Spanish, right? But all put together, they had more warriors than those three settlements until the mid 1760s. Okay, so for the first 80 years of the relationship that the Creeks have with the English, they simply outnumber them militarily. So they are the dominant military power in the Southeast. Now that's important for us to note. Okay, the Georgia colony, which is started in 1733 with 100 people, about 5 to 10 years later, only has about 1,000 people, and population is kind of moving slow until after the French and Indian War. So after 1763, immigration picks up. More people begin to come into Georgia. By about 1768, they have about 6,000 people in Georgia. And then quickly, right, by the mid 1760s, about 6,000. And then quickly, they have about 35,000 people in 1770, right before the Revolution. And that has a lot to do with Georgia is offering free land to people to come and settle in Georgia. Okay, so as we'll see, there's going to be some tensions in the mid 1760s between the Creeks and the English that we'll get to in a second. Now, the other thing we need to mention is from the English side, why are they so interested in deerskins? What's going on? Well, there were several times in the 18th century in which the cattle in Europe got a disease that thinned their hides out, and so made them basically useless, made cattle hides useless for making leather, right? And so there were shortages for several decades in the 18th century, meaning that these hides, deerskins, were in high demand. Okay, so the English have a desire to trade with the Creeks, and the Creeks have a desire to acquire manufactured products. Okay, so with that, let's see what we have. Okay, so our first point of discussion is this little excerpt from a document by an English trader, Thomas Nairn, from the early 18th century. And I think this is in the 1730s here, this document, if I'm not mistaken. He is discussing the Creek trade here, the Creek trade. So what I'm going to do is, this is on the documents, but I put it up on the slide, and then I will stop for a second and we'll talk, and then we'll come back to the PowerPoint for the next document. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, it is the easiest thing in the world for an English traveler to procure kindred among the Indians. It's but taking a mistress of such a name, which means clan. The Creeks were divided into different clans or families. And he has at once relations in each village, from Charlestown to the Mississippi. And if traveling, he acquaints them with what family he is incorporated into, those of that name treat and wait on him as their kinsman. There are some of our countrymen of such prudence and forecast that in case one family should fail them, take care to make themselves akin to several. Okay, all right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a minute so we can chat for a second. Okay, so let's see, what is Nairn describing here? Let's think about this. So he's talking about traders who are coming back into Creek country, and I'll explain a little bit more about what they're doing in a minute. But what does he seem to be indicating here? Let's think about this. What's going on first in this excerpt? Kind of what's the facts of the matter? Okay, it does say, yes, it is positive at first, absolutely. Let's think a little bit about what he's describing here. So he says a The trader will go back into Creek country, and then what does he do? Let's think about what he does first. So what does it mean he's taking a mistress? Yes, Candy, yes. It's easy to trade at first. Yes, right. Yeah, he's getting a woman. Exactly, right. So now he's not getting a woman as just in taking up with someone, right? He's hooking up or something, right? You could, yeah, I mean, they did have that in Creek country, but he's marrying this woman. That's right. Okay, we'll talk about how that works out. Okay, he is, Catherine said, yes, he is marrying this woman. Okay. Now, all right, now he also, what seems to be the reason why he's marrying the woman? But you could put it in the chat if you wish. Why is he marrying her? What does Nairn say? Yes, to build relationship, Catherine, exactly. Now, all right, so the Creeks are organized into, yes, into build relationships. They're organized into different clan groups, right? I say a best way to understand it for our purposes, and I know this is an anachronism, so it's going to be, it's not a perfect analogy, but to think of it as fans of different SEC football teams, right? So in other words, there are different clans, if you will. You see what I'm saying? Like you can travel throughout the South and say, oh, you're a UK fan, or you're an LSU fan, or what have you, Alabama fan, right? And all of a sudden you have some kind of rapport there. Okay, so part of what's going on, right? And I know that's maybe not the best analogy, but the Creeks are organized into different clan groups, families, right? But these are families that are much broader. They live, they live over numerous different villages. And so therefore, right, the trader would have basically a family in all of the villages, right, in which his wife's clan lived, right? So let's say the Wind clan, that was one of the Creek clans, had residents in 7 villages. Well, that trader could go to each of those 7 villages and present himself as a member of the Wind clan. And they would accept him as one of their kinsmen. Now, he had to be married in the Creek ceremony. Right. Now, Nairn also says here, however, that some of the traders seem to be, what do they seem to be doing? Notice he says they make themselves akin to several. What does that mean? See what we have. Yes, polygamy is right. They're getting married to numerous women, right? And they marry them from different clans, right? So they can have more access. Does that make sense? Yes, they're marrying into several clans, right? Okay, so they're gaining access, right? Okay, so let's think about this. There's going to be, we're going to look at a couple of other points here. So what does this tell us? What do you think this tells us about? Yeah, they're fans of a lot of teams, right, Wendy? All right, what does this tell us, right, about the cultural expectations of the Creeks? Okay, so why would it be that the traders, as Nairn says, have to marry the Creeks in order to begin trading with them? Let's think about that. Anybody speculate? Let's think about this. Why would they do this? Yeah, okay, so it could be, in some cases, we know that traders they do marry, like we would say, for love, if you will, right? In other words, their marriages often last a long time. Others are just hooking up for convenience, perhaps, right? Yes, Catherine says wealth is sharing with one another, so family would be who they would want to trade with. Okay, you're onto something, right? Okay, so for the Creeks, now as we'll see, we'll try to tease out what their view of wealth is. That's kind of a disputed point. But in general, Creeks only wanted to trade with people who were members of their families. Now, I say family, I use that term broadly, right? Or somebody who was part of their tribe, if you will, or clan here. So why would that be? Let's think about that. Let's think about that. So let's think about trade, how it works out, right? Remember, we said it's a mutual exchange, right? A mutual exchange. Now, yesterday I went to the store. I had to purchase new tires for my car, and the person who sold me my tires, and then I had to leave the car there, and she told me I could pick it up in a few hours. You know, she had dyed half her hair blue and half her hair pink and had 5 rings through her nose and lips and so forth. And I would say, and I didn't think anything of, right, giving her my keys to my car and telling her, call me when it's done, right? Now, if that person knocked on my door, I would say, who are you and what do you want here? But why am I willing to trade with her that way? Yes, Sabrina says it's a trust issue. It is, yes. Okay, so think about that. In our culture, right? In our culture, do you know the person you buy things from? Not necessarily, right? I mean, maybe you go to the local store and you know the proprietor or something, but most of the time we buy things anonymously. You see what I'm saying? But think about this. In a mutual exchange, yeah, we're buying from Amazon, right? And in mutual exchange, right? I'm trusting that you're going to give me a product. You're giving me what you say, and I'm giving you what I say. Now, if we have a problem in our culture, who adjudicates? Well, the state does, right? We file a lawsuit, or the police intervene, right? And we handle this way. Well, for the Creeks, right? Trade for them, right? Their argument was that we need to trust the people we're doing business with, right? And the best way to trust them is for them to be part of the family. Okay, now we see this attitude not just in Native American cultures, but in cultures all over the globe. This is a common experience of cultures before the modern world, right? Okay, so it's an issue of trust. Catherine, you're right. There, in the Creeks particularly, did not necessarily trust other tribes or clans, but they trusted their own. Now, that was part of the issue. Okay, now I'm going to come back. We'll go back and look at a couple of things for a second. Okay. Yeah, let's try that. Okay. Now I should be back on screen share here. Okay, so notice this point here at the top here that English traders are expected to conform to the Creek culture in order to gain access to the trade. Okay, now as we know, I mean, it wasn't legal in the English colonies to take more than one wife, right? Or to take multiple wives and, you know, move around, do all this stuff. I mean, that was illegal. So the point is that some of the traders are willing to do this, tells us, right, that who is in charge of the trade, right? Who's calling the shots? Well, in this case, it seems that the Creeks are calling the shots by making others conform to their culture in order to trade with them. Okay, so they're forcing the English to make cultural concessions at first. Now, this shows us, right, it seems, right, that this action, notice the Creeks, we don't have their words here, but their actions seem to indicate to us, right, that they're the ones who are playing from the position of power. Okay. Right, because remember, they are the dominant military power in the region for 100 years. Okay. All right, so let's look at how the trade then develops, right? Okay, so as these traders are coming, right, where are they coming from? Usually from Charleston or Charlestown, it was called before the Revolution, and many of the traders are located in Augusta, Georgia, right, which is right on the Savannah River, about 60 miles north of Savannah. And Augusta was the beginning of the two major paths that went through Creek country, right? Okay, there were two trade paths, trade routes, and they were they stem from Augusta. Okay, so let's look and see. Let's see here. Well, we know, for example, that in any kind of trade, right, people are looking for an advantage. Now, we all do this without even thinking of it, right? So I want to buy a new car. Do I just like walk down the street to the dealership and say, give me a new car? Well, I mean, some people might do that, but usually we're going to shop for the best bargain we can get, right? So if we're going to cough up the cash, I want to make sure I get a good deal on it. That's common behavior. And as we'll see, the Creeks learn this pretty well too. All right, so at first, the way the trade's established is that the Creek chiefs, so they were called Micos, right, at first only would allow one trader in each Creek village. The villages the Creeks called were talwas. That was their word for a village, okay. And each village had, like, so a large Creek village had about 1,000 people living there, right? So these are not huge cities, right? These are small settlements, right? And so it's usually between 250 to 1,000 is a Creek village. All right, now, when a trader would show up, usually the Miko would often try to marry one of his daughters to the trader. And the reason why is because somebody had put this in the chat earlier about wealth, right? So it was because that the chief or the Miko, right, could or demanded that each year his son-in-laws had to give him gifts, right? Now, sometimes he would give them gifts, but oftentimes, right, there was this obligation that you had to provide gifts for the Miko. So in other words, the Miko, right, wants a kind of first cut at what goods the trader has. So if he marries his daughter to one of the traders, the trader then had to provide annual gifts to the Mikos, right? Annual gifts each year. Now, we know that the traders did not always like this because we have letters of them complaining that they're losing money by doing this, and they're complaining back to their different merchants on the coast and even in London, saying that this is getting out of hand, right? But notice that the Mikos, right, they said this is part of the deal, right? You want to trade here, you got to be part of the family, otherwise we won't trade with you. And the other thing is that you have an obligation to give us gifts, right? This is how things work. Okay. So, right, let's think about how, so we know in the first quotation that the traders try to take advantage sometimes of the Creeks by marrying into different clans, right? Taking multiple wives to try, which was okay in Creek culture, by the way. But they had to, they married into different clans in order to get more access. Now, in this case, we're going to look at a letter from William Bartram, who traveled through Creek country in the early 1770s and then published the journals of his travels in 1791. And he's going to, in this document, show how the Creeks are trying to take advantage here. So in the first document, we saw the English trying to play the game. Now let's see what this document says about Creek women. All right. So Bartram says this. Remember, he's describing what he saw in the 1770s, right before the Revolution. Traders are fully sensible how greatly it is to their advantage to gain he's talking about Creek women's, affections and friendship in matters of trade and commerce. And if their love and esteem for each other is sincere and upon principles of reciprocity, there are but few instances of their neglecting or betraying the interests and views of their temporary husbands. They labor and watch constantly to promote their private interests and detect and prevent any plots or evil designs which may threaten their persons or operate against their trade or business. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing screen for a minute. Okay, so let's think about what Bartram is observing. Now, again, we don't see, this is from his eyes, not the Indian's eyes. He's observing behavior that he's seen from others, right? And from his observations there. And he's making an observation about the Creek wives of traders. You see what I'm saying? So what is he saying here about them? What's going on here? What does he notice that, how are they acting here? See what you're, put anything in the chat here. Yes, they're very helpful. Okay, now the question is, right, notice how Bartram says this at first, in the beginning, the first sentence is that he says the traders are very aware that they need to gain the affection and friendship, he says, right, of their native wives. You see what I'm saying? So, well, Melissa says they are helpful, but don't trust. Maybe, but who are they looking out for first? That's really the key. Who would they look? Yeah, they're right. They're looking out for their clan and themselves. Exactly, right? Because let's go back and think about what we saw. So when a trader married into a family, right, into a clan, what did he have to provide each year for that clan? Well, gifts. And those gifts were from, right, if you think about it, it was from his stock of goods that he would bring in, or he'd bring into Creek country each year. So notice what Bartram says about how do Creek women know what's going on in the trade? Are they aware of what their husband's up to? Heck yeah, yeah, women always know. Yeah, no doubt about that. No doubt about that. Yes, you are right. Yes, yes, they know. They know, right? So in other words here, this is kind of an interesting document or an interesting admission by Bartram on many grounds. Is here the Creek women seem to be major players in this game. They're kind of brokers, if you will. You see what I'm saying? Now, they may love their husbands and their husbands may love them. And certainly we have numerous accounts of this, right, in the history of the 18th century, right, of the traders and their Indian wives. But on the other hand, these women are also trying to manipulate the trade to serve their own interests in the interests of their clan. Does that make sense? So you see how both sides are trying to get the best deal. You see what I'm saying? Both sides are trying to play the other, just like you go shopping at 10 dealerships and get the best price for your car rather than showing up at one. Okay, so the point is both sides are trying to get the best deal they can. And in this case, right, we have a clear account where the Indians do have what scholars refer to as agency, right? That is that they are actors themselves, right? In real ways. They're not just being acted upon. That's very important for us to know. Okay. All right. All right, let's go forward. Let's go forward. I'll share my screen again. Any other points about this document that you find this interesting or here we have a little observation. I wish we would have some of the words of the Creek women themselves, but again, this is the problem. So we have this source and we know what their actions are. So we're trying to interpret from their actions. How do we put these actions together? Okay. All right, now let me go back to sharing. Okay, so, all right, now, all right, so let's go back into, all right, so let's look at another aspect of the trade. So we're going to describe, I've got a number of documents about describing how the trade worked and some problems that came up with the trade. And then we're going to look at how these problems, how they attempted to solve these problems. Okay, so what we've seen thus far, right, is that the English have to conform to the Creek culture at first in order to trade, and that they have to give gifts to the Creeks. They got to take Indian wives, and that these wives are more savvy than perhaps the English initially assumed they would be, right? But anyhow, the point is that, right, the Creeks have real power here in the trade, and they want the trade, right? They want that it benefits them, right? And the English want the trade; it benefits them. All right, so let's move on now. So when we begin to look at the effects of trade, right? So sometimes when trade occurs, new products are introduced that reshape the culture of the participants, right? So this happens all the time when new technologies are introduced. Like, for example, I look back in great affection for the days before the iPhone, where my students aren't like have their phone under their desk all the time texting, right? Or what have you, right? Those are the great days, right? Where I could, we could actually have a conversation that lasted more than 2 minutes. But, right, technology changes things. New products change the way people do things. All right, and many times these these effects are unintended, right, and unforeseen. Other times there may be more nefarious, right? People introduce something for bad purposes, but for the most part, right, what we can see is that there could be a mixture of both things, right? Now we're going to look at two effects of the trade upon the Creeks here. Some effects take years to develop, and some effects are quicker to manifest themselves. All right, so let's see what we have. Okay, so the first one is alcohol. All right, so the native peoples of North America, for the most part, did not have alcohol prior to Europeans. They certainly did not have distilled spirits. And so what happens is that when rum is introduced into Creek country, it produces a huge desire for it. All right. Now, the rum that is brought in, let's talk a little bit about it. It was usually brought in because all things in Creek country had to be brought in, usually from Augusta or Charleston, but usually they would launch out of Augusta and they would be taken to the Creeks towns on horseback or mules or whatever, right? And usually rum was packed in 4-gallon casks that were then you could put one on each side of the horse and one on his back, so to speak. So you could basically get about 12 gallons of rum per horse if you could get it in there. Now, the rum that was sold was often called tafia. So this was a rum that was produced in the Caribbean from the leftover pressings of the sugar cane. Okay, so this was kind of the low quality rum. This isn't like the really nice, flavorful rum. This is kind of like with rot gut, maybe, right? So, and then when it would come in, right, then the traders could and would bottle it into smaller bottles and often cut it with water, right? So that was also an issue because they wanted to sell more of it, right? So here's some rum. And the Indians would desire it tremendously. Okay, so now what we're going to do is look at another document by a man named George Stiggins. So Stiggins had an English father and a Creek mother. He grew up in Creek country, and in the very early 19th century, in the early 1800s, he writes this description of what happens with rum. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about this. So here's what Stiggins says. He says, chiefs, common men and women will wallow in filth and mire so long as they can raise the means to purchase spirits to drink. During such time of frenzy, they will fight each other indiscriminately, frequently taking each other's lives. And when such fracas is over, they attribute the whole scene to the spirits they have drank, very truly saying it was not them but the liquor that was in them that fought, well knowing and meaning their peaceable disposition toward each other when in their natural state of sobriety. Okay, so this sounds like, right, scenes from a raucous bar, right? Bar fights. Okay. Now let's think about, there's some points here that we should make mention of, and I'm going to unshare my screen for a minute. So let's talk about this one for a second. All right. So Stiggins is, let's observe what he's saying here. Who's involved in drinking here? Drinking rum. Let's see, who's involved in it? What does he tell us here? That first line is pretty interesting. Yeah, more. Notice what he says. Not just men, chiefs too. Who else? Stiggins wasn't good at punctuation. I reproduced his thing completely, but he has three groups in that first sentence. Chiefs. He calls them common men, average men, and women. Right. So in other words, right, alcohol was desired by just about everybody in Creek country. In other words, right, everyone wanted it. Okay. So notice that's very interesting, right? That's actually a very important point, right? So what happens after they start drinking? In fact, he says they can't wait. They'll live in filth as long as they can raise enough money to buy some liquor, right? To buy some rum. So what is it? What happens when they start drinking? Yes, fights, lots of fights, right? In other words, murders, fights, and when does it stop? Well, it stops when they run out of liquor. Right. So some historians have said, look, so yeah, they have become the alcoholics of today. You're right. So what happens, we could say, right, and historians have pointed this out, that because there was no alcohol in native societies, there was no kind of there was no moral opinion in native societies about alcohol use, right? Now, later on, obviously that comes, and certainly Stiggins is saying this is a terrible thing. But what's going on is that this is a description of people who have a horrible addiction, is it not? Okay, and are caught in some real problems are manifesting themselves. Now, this is kind of interesting. So in 1733, when the colony of Georgia is founded and settled, James Oglethorpe, one of the trustees who comes to the colony and kind of sets it up, Oglethorpe bans rum from the colony. Right, so he says no rum here, and that was because he did not want rum being used in the Indian trade, in the Creek trade, right? Because he knew, because he had heard, of course, he had never been to America. But when he comes, he knows that this has caused a great deal of abuse. And of course, any of you who know alcoholic folks or had to grow up with them or such know the pain that causes and the difficulty that causes in people's lives. And so the point here, right, notice here is that this new product that's coming into Creek country is having a real cost, right, in the lives of Native peoples and in their culture. Okay. All right. Now I'm gonna share again, share the screen. We're going to look at a couple of other things here. All right. Let's see what I've got. Okay. Oh, there we go. Stiggins. All right. Let's go to the next one. Okay. So another effect. So alcohol is something that is problematic, obviously. And it's problematic and it's recognized on the side of the English as well. Efforts are made to try to prohibit rum, trading of rum, although that never worked any more than our drug laws seem to cut off the supply of drugs in America. So alcohol was making its way back into Creek country, regardless of what the authorities had been saying. So let's look at the question of debt. So here's the other issue that is becoming a huge problem. All right, so in order to understand the problem of debt, we've got to look at it from the English side first, and then from the Creek side to see how this problem came about. So remember, the English traders are offering goods to the Creeks, clothing, iron pots, knives, guns, right? And all of those products come from England. Okay, so that's where they're coming from. Now, so how did this work out? Well, merchants who traded between England and the colonies, North American colonies, would usually purchase a set of goods, trade goods, and ship them over once a year. Now, this is just describing the Creek trade. The mercantile relationships were different and more complex, but in this case, we're going to make kind of a simplistic chain, but one that is not inaccurate. All right, so the merchants would purchase goods annually, and then they would pay to transport them to the colonies and insure them against loss. So if your ship sunk, you would be out all of this money. Now, the key, right, the key in how this chain works is that the merchants do not control the price of the goods at their source. Right. So in other words, the merchants are not the producers of the goods, they're buying them. So prices might fluctuate from year to year. Right. And so that's important. Merchants who are buying the trade goods, they bring them across the Atlantic. Right. They do not control the price of them. Let's look at some other things. Now, so the trade goods show up in Charleston or Savannah. Right. They are unloaded from the ship. And so the question is, who's going to bring them back to Creek country? Well, we know the traders, but what goes on with the traders? Like what's going on here? Well, the English governments in South Carolina and in Georgia do try to control the trade by licensing. Okay. Now, as we'll see, that's going to be an issue, but they require anyone involved in the Indian trade to buy a license each year. Okay, so in other words, that provides a fee to the government, right, to the colonial government. And they require traders in Georgia, at least, to post bond before going into Creek country. So in other words, think about that. What that would mean is that you would pay your license fee and you would pay, let's say, a bond of, I don't know, 100 pounds or something. Probably wouldn't be that much, 50 pounds. And then you could reclaim that bond when you came back to Augusta or Savannah or Charleston, wherever you were headed, right? And the idea was that if you went into Creek country and caused trouble, like maybe you cheated the Indians and they started a war or something like that, or you had engaged in some kind of practice that really made the native peoples enraged, if you will, and caused issues, you would lose that bond. Okay, so they were trying to create an incentive for traders to not cause trouble, right? And the other thing, right, that they're interested in is by licensing this and making them post bonds, they want to reduce the number of traders as well. Okay, that's the government's, right, the colonial government's interest in this. right? They want to reduce the traders by licensing them so they can control them, right? And make them take bonds out and such. Now, why is that? Well, the governors of the colonies understood that traders could often cause difficulties with native tribes, and that this would sometimes mean violence would result that could blow up into something much more, which would be much more costly and dangerous for the colony. So they're trying to control it. Now, all right, so the next part of the process is, so here's our trader. He has gotten his bond, he's gotten his license. Now he's going to pack up his goods that he has, and he's going to then bring them into Creek country. All right, so they have to incur the cost then to travel through Creek country. And that's often very treacherous. They have to cross a number of rivers, creeks, this, that, and the other. It's all common that goods are lost, this, that, and the other, right? And then, of course, they have to take up residence in the Creek village, and they have to give gifts to their adopted their wife's family, right? Okay. Now, then the Creeks go out and hunt the deer, right, for the skins, and they come back to pay. This helps pay for the manufactured goods. Now, oftentimes what happens is, at first, although this does change over time, the traders will establish like a little store, usually right outside the village, the town. And the trader will give credit to the hunters. And they say, look, a hunter comes in and says, I need gunpowder and shot to go out and hunt. So this would be provided on credit, right? So it's kind of the credit card. Oh, okay, now that's the problem, right? So you get the guns, you get the ammunition, and sometimes you get supplies or other things, and it's given to you on credit. Okay, now, remember, so the Indians go out, they hunt the deer, they skin them. Usually the women are the ones preparing the skins, and then they give them to the traders. And the traders have to make sure they're dried so they don't rot. They bundle them all up, and then usually once a year after hunting season, they would transport them out of Creek country, go back to the coast where they would sell them to a merchant. And then they would pick up the next year's supply of goods and come back to Creek country. Does it make sense? So this process would take maybe several months to do, right? And then the skins are put on boats and transported back to England. Okay, now that's a pretty complex supply chain, we could call it, right? For this process. All right. Now, there's some let's say risks involved on both sides, right? So one of the risks is that the traders have to sell their goods on credit, meaning that they're taking a bit of a risk that the natives will come back with deer skins. Now, traders did not know the exact price that deer skins would fetch in London. They had to guess. So again, the price of deer skins goes up and down in the 18th century in London. That's where they're being sold ultimately, right? So in other words, if I'm a trader in a Creek village and I've got, let's say, 300 deer skins, last year I might have gotten, I don't know, let's just pretend $5 a skin, but this year that might only be $4.50. I have no way of knowing. That knowledge isn't available to me at the time. There's no instant communication. I have no idea what the price is. And so therefore, the trader has to guess. Now, how do you think the trader's going to guess? In his favor or the Creek hunter's favor? Well, of course, in his favor. In the Creek's favor. In the trader's favor, right? So that means he's not going to probably give the hunters as good of a price, right? Not because he's somehow trying to harm them or cheat them, although to the Creek hunter it might appear that way, but because he simply doesn't know what he can sell them for, right? There's a problem of knowledge, right? And so the risk for the trader is that if he guesses wrong, right, he'll be out of business. He'll go bankrupt. Okay. Now, there's a couple of things that are kind of interesting about this. Well, a couple of things, and we'll complicate it a little bit more in a second. But the Creeks also, right, they don't like the fact that the price of goods goes up and down each year, right? To us, this seems common. We live in a commercial society. Sometimes, the price of food is high, sometimes it's low, gas prices up and down. We just assume this is part of our lives. But the Creeks they don't understand the supply chain. They don't see that, right? And so they want the traders to give them what they call price lists. So they would negotiate and they would say, okay, here's for the 50 goods that you bring into Creek country, we're going to designate how many deer skins pay for each product, right? Or the amount of each product. Okay. So who do you think wanted, did you think the traders want to fix prices on all the goods? Well, of course not, because, right, they don't know, right, what those prices of goods will be each year back in England, where they have to buy them and sell them. You see that? So those prices will go up and down each year. They don't want to fix the price for the Creeks, right? Because that would threaten the traders with going out of business if things don't work out well. All right, we're getting there. We're getting there, and we'll see some other issues in a second. Okay, so the last part of our debt chain here, therefore, is that, look, the traders are essentially speculating in the trade. So that means that they're risking their money, right? They're risking their money. They're trying to get as much money as they can, but this is kind of a risky business, right? Now, the Creeks get into debt. They go into debt each year. But they also want a continuous supply of goods, right? So they want the traders to come back each year. Now, if you have a bad year hunting and you don't get as many skins, or the trader doesn't sell, he doesn't get the price he needs for things, you're going to have issues, right? There's debt on both sides of the equation. But remember, the Micos are in charge here. They allow the traders in. They negotiate with the traders for different things. So both sides wish for the trade to continue, but both sides experience certain difficulties. So on the side of the traders, the markets are uncertain. They don't know what the price of things are going to be from year to year. For the Indians, the other problem they had, overhunting. So by the 1760s, right, the Creeks were overhunting the deer. And so therefore, there just wasn't as many deer left. They had to go further out to find deer. And this did not always work out for them, right? Scholars have estimated that each hunter, and usually this is about 13,000 Creek hunters who would go out and hunt each year, would kill about 50 deer a year. Okay, would kill about 50 deer a year. Okay. That's the best estimate that we have off of our remaining statistics. So that's a significant amount. I mean, you can imagine over the century that they have this relationship, deer herds are going to decline. Now, all right, so the question becomes, right, what do the Creeks have that they can use to pay off their debt? So if they can't pay their debts off year to year because they get in the hole, is there something that they have that they can use to pay off their debts? So what ends up happening is in 1773, the colonial governor of Georgia, his name was James Wright, says, I have an idea. The Creeks can cede us land. They can give us some of their land because we need more land in Georgia. We're filling up. And after we sell that, the state will sell the land and then pay the debts that the Creeks owe the traders, right? So that the Creeks can trade their land for their debt. Now, this is a real threat, and the Creeks understood this. But remember, they've been trading now for 90 years with the English. They've never had to trade land for debt, but by 1773, things have changed. Things have changed. Okay. So what we want to do, right, is we want to look at this last few years here where this is kind of the fatal move, right? Once once the Indians have to sell some of their land, well, that's going to mean that this trade can take on a much different purpose than it did back in 1713 or something. See what I'm saying? Where the Creeks are in charge, they're getting good deals, right? But now by 1773, the cost of the trade is something significant. It could mean they have to give up significant amounts of land. All right, so let's look at this last phase, and we'll have some documents and we'll talk about them in a second. Okay, so 1760s. There are a number of people who are complaining about the trade, Creeks and English, and they're asking the British government to get involved. And they say, British government, you need to pass some new regulations to regulate this trade because it's unfair now. Okay, so on the English side, people were complaining. They were writing letters back to the Board of Trade, back to Parliament, saying, hey, you know, the problem is that these traders are, they're kind of handpicked by the governors. They're kind of given special economic privileges, right? The governors are, limiting how many traders are going out. And this is unfair because these traders can make some serious cash, right? If they got a good year. And so we want to kind of deregulate the trade. Other English, we need more regulation of the trade because the trade is getting a little more dicey now. You've got these debts that can't be paid. What are we going to do? So the English have their issues. Now the Creeks also have issues. They say, look, we've got some serious issues here. The issues is we can't control the price of what trade goods we get, and the deer herds are diminishing. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Their economy begins to change by the mid 1760s, and the Creek economy goes from hunting deer skins to more ranching, raising cattle for different markets. But they're still hunting up till the Revolution, right? Is really this what we're talking about. Okay, so let's see, right? When the government gets involved, they might regulate things, but they're going to inject a new set of incentives and rewards in the trade. So the new laws or regulations might again cause unforeseen effects on the trade. All right, I've been talking too long. We'll get there. 1 second. We're going to look at a document. All right, so let's see what happens. So remember the British regulations thus far. The licensed and bonded traders, this limits the numbers. Essentially, we could say that the colonial governments have kind of a monopoly, so to speak. They control the supply of traders, right? And this potentially controls the price. In other words, when there's not competition among traders, are you going to get the best price for your goods? Well, probably not. Okay, so for the Creeks, right, the old system had an advantage that it was relatively stable, and the traders were limited, and they had to marry into the Creek families. However, the Creeks weren't always getting the best price, so they thought. Okay, so in 1763, the British decide to lift many of their regulations on traders. All right, so let's look at this document. Let's look at this document. Okay, so John Stuart was the Indian agent of the king. That was his title. And he, in 1767, writes a letter back to London detailing some of the problems that have come about since now the trade has been deregulated. In other words, that they've opened up the trade to all these different traders. You don't have to get a license anymore. You can go back into Creek country and trade. So it says a number of new traders have been sent into the towns where there were already old ones. each of them carrying a quantity of goods equal to what they did, by which means the Indians now have a double supply in their towns. Other new traders, finding no room in the towns, have betaken themselves to the woods and settled themselves at Indians' plantations in their hunting grounds, where they use every art to get the skins from the Indian before he returns to his town. If he passes there and comes home, competition arises betwixt the old and new traders for his custom, that is, for his trade. The latter has recourse to underselling, that is, the new traders are underselling, and being many of them men of no character or property, stick at no arts to gain their point, and provided they can get skins, will not consider what they cost, thereby raising disgust and dissatisfaction amongst the Indians, and occasioning them to desire further deductions, as imagining themselves hitherto to have been imposed upon. Okay, now that's a mouthful of 18th century English. So let's stop sharing and look at this. All right, there's a lot in this document that we need to make mention of. Okay, so the issue is, right, let's think of the issue. Remember, each year the Creek men would go out to hunt, and by this time they have to go far away from their villages because the herds of deer have moved farther away. So they have to go out for months at a time. And so let's say they kill their 40 deer and they're bringing back their deer skins. What does Stewart tell us? So when these Indians are now going back home, right, from their 3-month-long hunt, what's happening? What's happening to them? Who approaches them? Who approaches them? Let's put in the chat. Let's see what we have. Brandy and Des, I will talk about it. Well, Brandy, I'll address your issue in a little while. Okay, so who is here? What's going on? What's going on? The Indians are out hunting, they're coming back, and who do they have to confront? Or who's confronting them, trying to deal with it? Okay, so remember, the old traders are living in the towns. Those are the people who are married to the Miko's daughter and this, that, and the other. Now you have these new traders who are coming back into Creek country, and what is their relationship with the Creeks and the English? So they're not necessarily new Europeans, Lynn, but new traders. What he means by the new traders these are people who before 1763 were locked out of the trade, usually for economic reasons. They couldn't afford the license and bond. You see what I'm saying? So what happens is all of a sudden these new traders, these are people who are new to the business, they come back into Creek country, and do you think they're going to get a good deal if they show up at the Talwa where you have an old trader there who's been there for 20 years trading? Is the Miko necessarily going to let him, this new trader, into the town? Maybe, maybe not, probably not. So where do the new traders have to go? How are they going to cut a deal, get the deer skins that they need? What's going on here? Where do they meet the hunters? Yes, on the hunting grounds, right. So they're going out to try to find them in the woods, so to speak, right? And the issue there is that what are they then doing? Let's think about this. So remember what's happened. The Indian hunter, right, has negotiated with the trader in his town for powder, shot, maybe his weapon, right, clothing for the year, and he's got to go out. Remember, he gets that on credit, and he goes out and hunts, and then brings the deer skin back, and that goes towards his debt. Remember, that's how the system goes. So here, if the hunter is out in the field and he's coming back with 40 skins, here comes a new trader along and say, hey, would you like to trade me or sell me some of those deer skins? Now, He said, I'll give you a better price. Yes, they're interrupting the trade of the old system. You're right, Catherine. So let's think about what would happen if I'm in debt to the trader in my village. I'm coming back from the hunting ground. I got this new trader who comes up and he says, hey, look, I'll give you a better deal. Or like, for example, since a number of the traders or a number of the colonies had been trying to limit rum and its entrance into Creek country, some of these new traders were notorious for bringing alcohol. So they're meeting me coming from my hunting grounds and they say, hey, Adam, how would you like, a gallon of rum? Give me 4 of your deer skins. Well, okay, let's say I do it. I have a nice time for a few days and then I go back to my town. What's going to be my problem when I show up at the old trader's house? Let's think about it. What's my problem? Right, Sabrina, no way to pay your debt. Right, you have no way to pay your debt. Now, right, very good. So you've not been able to pay your debt to the old trader. So guess what happens in the 1760s? The new traders come in because remember, people were complaining that the old trade was no good. It was increasing debt. It was unfair to the Indians and to other people wanting to engage in the trade. And so now they've opened the floodgates, got all these traders coming in, and they are trading. But guess what happens to debt in Creek country? Boom, it balloons. There's more credit available. So guess what happens? More people get into debt. They get deeper into debt. Right. So the question, Des, very good. Now, are they going to have to pay with their land? That is the issue. Exactly right. You see that? Now, that was not the intention of when Parliament agreed to allow more, they allowed to have more traders go into Creek country, that they opened the trade. That was not the intention, but that was going to be the result, as we'll see. Now, there's another issue. Let's look at this from what the Creeks were thinking. Let's look at this. So notice, let's look at this. So notice at the end of Stewart's document, I'm going to put it up there real quick again, just so we can see it. If you want to, let me see, give me a second. So look at the end of Stewart's document down where he says, so he says many of these new traders, because they're trying to establish their business, right? And he says they're men of no character. He says that they end up giving the Creeks great deals. And so what happens to the old traders? Let's look at this at the very end of the quotation, right? The Creeks say he says they're raising disgust and dissatisfaction among the Indians and occasioning them to desire further deductions, that is, deductions in price, as imagining themselves hitherto to have been imposed upon. In other words, what is Stewart saying? He's saying now the Creeks back in their towns are saying, they're scratching their heads saying, wait a second. This new trader's giving me a heck of a deal. What about you, old trader there? Have you been, for lack of a better term, screwing me over all these years, giving it, making me, giving me higher prices, padding your pockets rather than helping me? So all of a sudden, guess what happens? Are the Creeks satisfied with this new arrangement? Not really, right? Not really. And not only that, but notice these new traders going out on the hunting grounds in the woods, right? Trading with individuals in this way. That debt that's being incurred, or that they can't pay off their debts and such, is going to mean that the Creek towns are going to lose land. Well, they don't know this yet. I mean, they could lose land, right, to pay off that debt. And that's what, as we'll see, is talked about in a minute. Okay, so the unlicensed traders do proliferate. Let me put this up here. They do proliferate after 1763. And so the question I have for you, so there are two questions. Maybe we can put them in the chat. I'll come off in a minute. Why is there a demand for the unlicensed traders' services, first of all? And secondly, who are the British traders concerned about, right, in their complaint to Stuart? Okay, so let's go back. Let's see, right? So the traders have written John Stuart asking him to intervene, right? Yes, very good. Well, it could be that the old traders, exactly, Des says, the old traders might lose the deals they had with their buyers in England. Yes, because the new traders might not be able to pay their debts to them. That is a huge thing. Yes, absolutely, right? This is a problem, right? What about, let's think about this other issue. Why is there a demand for the services of the unlicensed traders? What do you think? Let's think about this. Remember, they are cutting deals. There are a lot of Creek hunters are trading with. Yes, they want less. Yes, very good. They want to. They're cheaper. Exactly. You got it. You got it. So in other words, now there's competition. Right? You think about it before. The one trader in the Creek Talwa in the Creek village, he has a monopoly. But now you've got people, right, offering different prices. And guess what? Creeks are buying cheap things. Yeah, it is a supply and demand thing, so to speak. You see that? Now, what does this tell us about the Creeks? Well, it tells us by the 1760s that they are now, the word we could use is accustomed to or accultured to the world of trade. You see what I'm saying? Like, in other words, now they're used to, right now they're searching for deals. They're cutting the best deal they can. They're trying to get out of debt by good means or bad, whatever, right? They're doing what consumers do in a market economy. Okay. So in other words, right, we've gone from a scene now where the Creeks have, at the beginning, controlled the trade on their terms, and their cultural terms won the day, to now, all of a sudden, by the 1760s, something has changed, right? Now the Creeks are actually very accustomed to this trading process. They're seeking the best deal possible, but they're also in this system in which they are about to be in over their heads. Okay, very good. All right, now, and so the old traders are worried that they're going to lose their control of the trade, right? You see what I'm saying? That these new traders are going to come in and bankrupt them all. This is going to cause problems. All right, so let's see, let's do this. Yep. Okay, so we're almost to the end. We got our last set to look at here. So what happens is in 1767, the Micos and some of the representatives of the English imperial and colonial governments meet in Augusta, Georgia. Remember, that's where the Creek paths, you know, the paths to Creek country, the trading paths originated, so or ended. They try to make a treaty, right? So they cut a treaty. They need to negotiate because the Micos and the English policymakers realized like the situation got a little bit out of control. Okay, got out of control. Okay, so let's look at two of the new regulations put in place and think about how these solutions would influence the trade further. Okay, so let's look at the first one. So the first one says, all goods shall be sold to the Indians according to a certain tariff or tax, heretofore annexed, and any trader by himself, servants, or substitutes selling goods to Indians at any other prices or rates than what are contained in said tariff, Okay, shall forfeit his bond and license unless in consequence of any alteration hereafter made and agreed to at a general meeting. Okay, so the first thing that what this is concerning here is that you could only, if you're a merchant, you can only, an Indian trader, excuse me, you can only trade goods at the agreed prices. At the agreed prices. Okay, now let's think about this. Who is this directed against? Who is this directed against? Like, in other words, who is this going to harm? That is their economic interests. Who is this against? Let's think about it. Put it in the chat. All right. So in other words, you can only sell, if you're a trader, you can only sell goods at these prices. And if you get caught selling goods at other prices, you're going to lose your license and bond. You'll be out. You're going to lose your business if you don't sell it at the agreed upon prices here. Let's think about that. Who is that going? It seems to be against the traders. Yes, Catherine, it is, right? Okay, very good. Particularly, it's going to be against the new traders, but also the old traders, right? Yeah, they have less, yeah, right. Okay, so they have less opportunity to make a trade. Because remember from the supply chain, that long thing that we talked about. Remember, what's the issue for the traders? They do not know the prices they're going to get for their deer skins that they're selling each year, or the goods that they're buying and bringing back to the colony. You see that? So in other words, their risk is increased by focusing on a specific, right? They have to offer a specific price. Now, who else will that potentially hurt? Right, Candy, good point. They may not get a profit. Exactly. That's the point. Exactly. All right. Now, who else might this harm? Maybe we don't think of it this way, but it is. Let's think about what we just learned about the Creeks. They're now very accustomed to commercial transactions, to trading and so forth and so on. So who else's interest might this harm? Let's think about this. Yes, Catherine, very good. The Creeks can also be hurt, particularly individual hunters, right? Who now, right, can't perhaps get what they need, right? So what's going to happen if the trader loses a lot of money one year, he's not going to be able to go buy the same amount of goods and bring them back into Creek country the next year. And in fact, oftentimes when you put price ceilings on things, right, you're going to create a shortage of whatever it is you're trying to regulate. And so this actually happens, as we'll see after the treaty. But now let's think about this. Okay, so let's think about, why would the English imperial officials and the colonial officials agree to this? What does that tell us about their intention? Let's think about that. What does that tell us about them? What are they interested in here? What do you think? Well, that is an interesting point, Rachel, that maybe they want to buy out all the other traders. Okay, that could be, or maybe they want to force them out. Right, you see what I'm saying? Now, the other thing, yeah, well, Brandy, that would seem to be a logical thing, but the trade in land is still 6 years away, right? So they're not, and in fact, when we look at the next regulation, we're going to see that I don't think that's what they're intending at this point, but they do. Yes, Mary, good. They want to control the trade again. Exactly. Because if the Creeks are unhappy, do they pose a threat to Georgia and South Carolina, a military threat? Yeah, they have 14,000 warriors. That's a huge army, right? In this part of the world at this time. Yes. So again, notice, who are the who, notice that the government in this case is willing to sacrifice the interest of their own traders. You see what I'm saying? For their goal of maintaining peace in the Southeast. Okay. All right. So this is let's look at the next one. Very good. Very good. Let's go to the next one and the next regulation. Oh, yep. Okay. We did that. Here we are. All right. Let me share it. Here we go. Okay. So here's number 9. This is point 9 of the treaty. Okay. Now this is another interesting part. So no trader shall credit any Indians for more than 30 pounds weight of Indian dressed deer skins. I'll explain what that means in a second. And all debts due by Indians above that sum shall be considered as not recoverable. Neither shall any trader credit an Indian for more than 5 pounds of gunpowder and 12 pounds of bullets in one hunting season. Okay, you see this? Now there's 2 issues going on here. Let's come back. All right. So let's try to put some stuff in the chat. So notice what's going on here. This is called your credit limit on your credit card, right? So what's the credit limit here? Let's think about it. What have they just said? The credit limit is what? Put it in the chat. What's the credit limit for Indian hunters? Let's think about this. Credit limit for Indian hunters. What is the credit limit in number 9? No trader shall credit any Indian for more than what? 30 pounds weight. Yeah, 30 pounds of deer skins. Okay, so the question is, how much is that? What does that actually mean? Okay, so a dressed deer skin means that the deer was killed and skinned, and then the flesh scraped off of it. It was partially tanned, right? The hair scraped off, partially tanned, and it would be finished in London, but it would be partially tanned. So an Indian dressed deer skin was partially finished, and usually they weighed, the average, according to the scholars, is about 1 pound per skin. Okay, so remember I said that scholars have estimated that the average Creek hunter killed between 40 and 50 deer a year, right? So let's say that this means, right? This means that 30 pounds of deer skin is probably about at least 2/3, if not more, right, of your annual output. So we could it would make it easy. It would be like, let's say your credit limit is 2/3 of your annual salary. That's what they're saying. Okay, now let's think about this. Why would the British government then? Okay, so what would happen if you as a trader offered more than 30 pounds credit, 30 pounds of dressed deer skins credit? What would happen if the native hunter could not pay? What would happen? What does it mean that shall be considered as not recoverable? That's right. You take the loss. That's right. So it's kind of like the Indian would go bankrupt, declare bankruptcy over 30 pounds. You should, okay, get the point. So in other words, the trader, if he did that, he could not recover that money. Now, okay, let's think about this as well. So why would the Creeks be interested in reducing or having credit limits here? Let's think about that. Why? Remember, these are the Mikas, the chiefs who are negotiating this. Why are they going to be interested in reducing how much credit is given or regulating? Let's think about this. Because what does that show that they're worried about? What do you think? Well, I don't know, April. We'll maybe, I guess. I don't know. They're worried about increasing debt. Exactly right. So the Creek chiefs are the Micos. They're worried about going into debt, right? Now, the land issue, like I said, the first land deal that they make to reduce debt is in 1773. It's a few years down the line. But certainly, if the English government wanted to drive the Indians into serious debt that they could never recover from and then make them cede their land for this, do you think they would give them credit limits? No, they would give them an unlimited amount of credit so that they could get as much land as they could. So in this case, it seems to indicate, right, again, that the British government is interested in peace with the Creeks, and they don't have designs on their land in 1767. In other words, if they did, they would simply raise the credit limit as much as they wanted, or to indefinite, and that way use that to get more of their land. Now, what's interesting is that in the early 19th century, we can find letters from a number of different politicians who are advocating we should get the Indians in huge debt and then take their lands in payment for the debt. But that comes back, that perspective is not yet here in 1767. That's later on. That is a kind of a tactic that some people want to employ. But here, that's not what is intended just yet, right? And we can probably tell this from the fact that would make, if that was your goal in 1767, that would make this provision would make no sense from the British or colonial perspective. Now, notice the last part of this provision, however, this regulation, is that you can't give or you can't credit an Indian for more than 5 pounds of gunpowder and 12 pounds of bullets in one hunting season. So what is this? What are they limiting to the Creeks here? Let's think about this. What are they limiting? Let's think about this. We could read this in several ways. Right? There's a couple of different ways we could do this. Yes, they are. Jenny, that's a good point. Yeah, firepower. Yes, you got it. You got it. Very good. So it limits their firepower and how much they can hunt. You're right, Des. So it can also be seen, it can be seen in different ways, right? You would say, well, why would the Creeks agree to this? Right? This is actually their limit. This is an arms limitation treaty, if you will, right? They're limiting their firepower. But from a Creek perspective, you could say, well, this also limits overhunting, right? In other words, we could manage the deer population better. We're not going to just be slaughtered, because remember, the only way you're going to pay off your debt is to sell deer skins. And if you're overhunting and the herds are declining, which they are, you've got an issue, right? You've got an issue. That resource has to be managed so you can pay down your debt. That's the issue. Okay, we're almost to the end. Yes, let's see. Yes, right. Okay, let me get to this. Almost done, almost done. Been good sports. Thank you. All right, so yes, okay. So what do you think the effects of these regulations were? Well, we know, for example, that the Treaty of Augusta did not really solve the issue. They can't get rid of the new traders. The Creeks are going into further debt, and what ends up happening is this leads to the 1773 deal that they make with Governor Wright to transfer land to Georgia in order to pay off their debts to the traders. Okay, and that seems to be kind of the key moment. Now, so remember that, let's look at what we've seen. Okay, I know this has been a long presentation, but there's a lot of different things that we can maybe think about here, right? So trade is a mutually agreed upon exchange of goods and services, right? And both sides perceive the trade as beneficial in some sense, right? So in other words, it might not be good for me, for example, to be, to have an iPhone. Maybe I would be better read and spend more time with my wife and kids if I wasn't looking at my phone all the time. But, right, I do see the iPhone as beneficial. So somebody could make an argument, well, Adam, the iPhone's not really good for you, right? Or maybe they could tell the Creeks, yeah, those that clothing and those iron pots and that gun, that's probably not good for you long term. But to the Creek hunters, they thought it was good for them. In other words, they perceived the trade as beneficial, which is why they were in it. Now, trade also operates within certain cultural parameters, as we've seen. And what we've seen is that at the beginning of the trade, Creek culture shaped the trade in significant ways. And the traders were supposed to adopt that culture. But as time went on, by the 1760s in the Treaty of Augusta, what has happened? Well, those restrictions have begun falling away, and the Creeks, because of debt, because of alcohol addiction, perhaps as well, has also changed the way that the trade worked, right? Their culture is maybe not running the show as much as it once was. Okay, again, that changes over time, right? And then trade often has unintended and unforeseen consequences, and thus the effects of trade can change over time. So the trade was perhaps mutually beneficial at the beginning, and both sides perceived it that way. But maybe after 100 years, the trade is not going exactly the way that one side wants. Well, in this case, the Creeks, right? And then remember that the government's regulations often create new incentives. It doesn't necessarily, it might solve one problem, but it might have unintended consequences and effects and cause other problems to pop up, right? So again, that's also interesting about this. So the last question is this issue of how does this change maybe our picture of Native and colonial relations, and how perhaps as teachers of this, do we remember to have a historical sense about how things change over time? And so what happens with, what happens in the 1830s is not necessarily happening in 1715, right? And so to tell the story of Native American relations with United States or colonial settlers is not, it shouldn't be an ideological project perhaps, but a historical one where we measure what changes over time, the different incentives that change as we go back and forth. As situations change, we see that the trade and the relationship of the different groups changes as well. Okay, so I will stop here and I will open it up to questions. You can put in the chat if you wish, or I could try to answer different questions that you may have, or if you want to make any comments about this, you can as well. Think any comments, questions? Oh, you're welcome, Sabrina. Thank you.
You guys open up, ask some questions there. I know Sabrina just posted that she enjoyed the discussion, as we all have, Adam. So we appreciate you being with us today. So anybody have any follow-ups, any thoughts? Did you all sketch note while we were doing that today? I did. So I got to share. Look at.
Very
so
cool.
There you go.
Yeah.
I know my head was like this, and you all probably think, what's he doing? But I was doing this and some of this. So just to show you what we put your learning into place, action, what we did this morning. So
very good. One of the things I would say is that you notice too that, I mean, this is a complex subject. It's not simply something easy. You see what I'm saying? I mean, there's a lot going on here. Now I've simplified it even more. That's a good, Kim, that's a good point. That's a very good point. That is, it's just not the case as we see. Yeah. Yes. Did the Indians ever revolt, say this is unfair? Oh, yes, absolutely. Now, what's interesting, Des, is so what happens to the Creeks is that, Catherine, good question. Okay, great stuff. Let me give you 1 minute. Okay, so Des is a good question. So what happens to the Creeks is the new purchase is negotiated in 1773, and it's not enacted because the Revolution breaks out. Well, when the Revolution breaks out, all of a sudden, Georgia's in the midst of a real like civil war between those who support the crown or those who support independence, and traders can't get goods to bring into Creek country. And so during the Revolution, the Creeks are saying this is terrible. Like, in other words, this is kind of the worst because we can't get all our stuff. Sounds like sounds like going to Walmart during the pandemic. The shelves are empty, at least at mine, right? I mean, in other words, you couldn't get the goods that you wanted to buy. And so one of the things that's interesting is that the Creeks, except for a couple of villages, stay out of the Revolution. Like, they don't want to join either side, but some of them join the British side so they can get access to trade goods. After the war, the Creeks welcome traders back. In other words, they can't wait for them to come back into Creek country. But by this time as well, the Creeks begin to have a division in their culture between those who want to continue the trade relationships and those who say, I don't think this has worked out well. And of course, that comes to a head in the Creek War in 1813. That's where Andrew Jackson comes down into Alabama, right, and defeats the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend in 1814. And the result of that, of course, the Treaty of Fort Jackson, was when the United States took half of Creek country to indemnify them for the cost of the war. Yeah. So definitely Mary's point, Creeks may have been influenced by fear of losing their land. Definitely later. Yes, absolutely. In the beginning, they're not even thinking about it. Let's see, the last point, let's see. Other Native Americans and colonists had similar trade issues. Yeah, okay, that's a great question. So I'm just giving you one example, right? Now, in other places, there was some of this. Maybe you could say that the experience in New France up in Canada was had some similarities to the Georgia Creek issue because the native hunters there were doing the same things that the Creeks were doing in Georgia. That is, they were going out and obtaining the product that was then being sold over in Europe. There were some of these relationships in other colonies as well. But this, you would have to flesh it out a little bit more. It's a little bit different from place to place. I know that's the danger of just talking about one tribe and one or two colonies. But the point is that, again, this is very complex. It changes over time. It's not, so the experience of Native Americans and others and the other colonies, it's not a universal experience. It changes from colony to colony. Did the British use goods throughout the colonies to get other Indian tribes to fight with them against the colonists? It's a great question. Well, both sides are sending diplomats to Indian country during the Revolution to try and get them to go on their side. This is a huge issue. It happens again during the War of 1812, of course. Yes, there are kind of lure of goods being put out there because, frankly, and this is the other part about it that we should say, is that the Creeks became dependent on technologies that they could not replicate themselves. And so I think about the computer. I have no idea how one works. I don't know how my cell phone works. If all those go, I'm back in the dark ages, right? But the Creeks, that was the same thing. So scholars have noticed that over a period of about 100 years, the Creeks had lost much of the cultural knowledge of how to survive in the southern woodlands, right? Then they had back in 1685 when they started the trade, because they had become dependent on technologies that they could not replicate. Very similar to how modern people, right? How we live, right? How we live. We use technology all the time that we have no idea how it works or how it's made. Yeah. Yes, that's a good, Kim, that's a good point. Yes. Good point. Very good. Good. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. I know Saturday afternoon is Saturday afternoon, and that was long and probably too much text on my PowerPoints and such, but I'm a text person. There's a lot of text there, but I hope that it was beneficial to you, and I wish you luck as you go forth and, in the classroom and such, and do some more learning and teaching. So thank you.
But we appreciate you, Dr. Tate, being with
All
us
right.
today. And the evaluation is in the chat. And just so everybody knows, Wendy had to step away for a church function. So Jackie and I are here if you need anything, have any questions, but we'll hang on as long as you want to. But so good to see you all. And thank you all for being part of our morning session and then afternoon. Again, Dr. Tate, appreciate it very much and hope to see you again soon. And
Very good.
We'll hang around. And if y'all need anything, as always, let us know. You all are absolutely the very best. So.
Okay. Thank you.